Ben sat by the entrance of the grocery store, the same spot he had occupied for months. It was early morning, and he was already feeling the bite of the cold air as he huddled in his worn-out jacket. Life had not been kind to Ben. Once a teacher at the local high school, a series of misfortunes had led him down this road. A tragic car accident had claimed his wife, and the medical bills that followed drained his savings. Soon after, he lost his job, his home, and any sense of stability he'd once known. With no family to turn to, he found himself on the streets, clinging to a few possessions and the memories of a better life. Despite his circumstances, Ben held on to a sense of dignity and kindness that many who passed him each day could feel. He rarely asked for money and often smiled at people who looked his way, offering a small nod or a greeting. Many ignored him, but he didn't mind. On this particular morning, he was nursing the remnants of a coffee a kind passerby had bought him when he noticed an elderly woman entering the store. She looked frail, with a gentle face etched by years of life and experience. Ben watched her go in, her steps careful but determined. Inside the store, Mrs. Taylor pushed her cart slowly, picking out only the essentials: milk, a loaf of bread, some canned soup, and a few apples. She lived alone on a small pension, carefully budgeting each month to make ends meet. Her husband had passed away years ago, and her children were grown and scattered across the country. She was used to managing on her own, but today she found herself struggling. As she approached the checkout counter and saw the total displayed, her heart sank. She realized she had miscalculated and was short by a few dollars. She fumbled in her purse, hoping to find some spare change, but came up empty. The cashier gave her a sympathetic smile, saying she could put an item or two back, but Mrs. Taylor's face grew red with embarrassment. She started to push her items aside when a voice interrupted her from behind. "Excuse me, ma'am. I can cover the difference." Mrs. Taylor turned around and saw Ben standing there, holding out a few crumpled bills. She was taken aback. Here was a man who clearly had so little, offering what little he did have to help her. For a moment, she hesitated, feeling both gratitude and a strange sense of shame. She wanted to say no, but the kindness in his eyes convinced her otherwise. With a small, grateful smile, she nodded, and he handed the money to the cashier. "Thank you, young man," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "It's nothing, ma'am," Ben replied with a humble smile. "We all need a little help sometimes." The other customers in line watched the interaction with surprise, murmuring among themselves. They had seen Ben outside the store countless times, sitting quietly, blending into the background of their daily lives. But this act of kindness forced them to look at him differently. As Mrs. Taylor gathered her bags and left, she turned back to give Ben one last thankful smile, but he had already gone, slipping back outside into his usual spot by the entrance. That evening, Mrs. Taylor couldn't stop thinking about the stranger who had helped her. She felt an overwhelming urge to repay his kindness somehow, to find him and thank him properly. She planned to go back the next day and look for him, maybe bring him a warm meal or even some money. He had done more than just cover her grocery bill. He had reminded her that kindness still existed, even in the most unexpected places. The next day, Mrs. Taylor returned to the store, scanning the entrance for Ben, but he was nowhere to be seen. She asked around, describing the man who had helped her, but no one seemed to know where he was. The store employees recognized her story, though, as they had witnessed the moment too. They told her they often saw him around but couldn't say exactly where he stayed. Disappointed but undeterred, she left a small envelope with the store manager, asking him to give it to Ben if he showed up. Inside was a handwritten note thanking him for his generosity and a small amount of cash. As days passed, the story of the homeless man's kindness spread throughout the town. People who had barely noticed Ben before started talking about him, sharing stories of the little things he had done for others. One woman recalled how he had helped her carry groceries to her car on a rainy day, refusing any offer of a reward. A young man remembered how Ben had given him his last dollar to buy a bus ticket home. These small acts of kindness began to paint a picture of a man who, despite his circumstances, had a heart filled with compassion. One evening, Mrs. Taylor received an anonymous envelope slipped under her door. Inside was the same amount of money she had left for Ben at the store. There was no note, but she knew it was from him. Her heart ached with both gratitude and sadness. Why would he refuse her help? She wanted to reach out to him, to offer more, but he had made his choice. News of this story reached the local paper, and soon, people from all corners of town were discussing Ben. Some questioned why a man with such kindness would be homeless. Others felt compelled to help him in some way. A few community members decided to look for him, wanting to thank him, to support him, perhaps even offer him shelter or work. But Ben was elusive, almost as if he wanted to remain a mystery. One cold winter night, Mrs. Taylor sat by her window, thinking about Ben and all he had done. She thought about the choices we make in life, about how sometimes the people who seem to have the least can often give the most. She wondered if Ben would ever let the town help him, or if he would continue living in the shadows, quietly making a difference one small act at a time. Days turned into weeks, but Mrs. Taylor couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to find Ben. His act of kindness had touched her in a way she hadn't felt in years. Despite her attempts, every visit to the grocery store ended in disappointment. Some of the store employees mentioned that they'd seen Ben here and there, but he seemed to move around town with a purpose known only to him. Word of his kindness had spread through the small town, and while some were touched, others found the story peculiar. It wasn't every day that a homeless man willingly parted with his money to help someone else, especially someone he didn't know. Determined to understand him, Mrs. Taylor started asking around at other places in town where people might have seen Ben. She visited the local park, the library, and even the community center, hoping to catch a glimpse of him or at least find someone who could tell her more. She discovered that Ben had his own small circle of people he looked out for. Other homeless individuals, a few struggling families, and even stray animals. Each person she spoke to seemed to know a different side of Ben, piecing together a mosaic of someone whose generosity seemed limitless, despite his own hardships. A few people Mrs. Taylor spoke to had their own stories of Ben's selflessness. There was Robert, a single father working double shifts to support his 2 young children. He recounted a rainy evening when his car had broken down, and Ben had been the only one to stop and help him push it off the road. Robert remembered offering him a few dollars as thanks, but Ben had refused. "You looked like you needed it more than I did," Ben had said with a quiet smile. Then there was Lydia, a teenager who confessed to Mrs. Taylor in a hushed voice that she'd been struggling with her mental health. Ben had often found her sitting alone in the park, and though they rarely spoke, he would leave small notes of encouragement for her, written on pieces of scrap paper he found. "You're stronger than you think, and one day at a time." The notes had given her a glimmer of hope in her darkest moments. As the puzzle of Ben's life began to come together, Mrs. Taylor became more determined than ever to find him. She started a quiet movement, asking people to keep an eye out for Ben and let her know if they saw him. She wanted to thank him, yes, but more than that, she wanted to offer him something meaningful, a way out of his hardships. She discussed it with her friends at the senior center, many of whom were initially hesitant. Some of them didn't understand why she was so invested in a man who, to them, was just another stranger in town. But her persistence, combined with the stories of Ben's kindness, eventually moved them. Soon, a small group was organizing to see if they could set up a fund or some kind of support system to help him. One evening, as Mrs. Taylor was walking home from a community meeting, she noticed a figure sitting by the old fountain in the town square. She was taken aback, unable to understand why he would refuse the opportunity. In her world, it didn't make sense. Everyone wanted security, comfort, a place to call their own. But Ben's world was different. He explained that after losing his family, he had struggled with guilt and loss, and he felt a strange sense of freedom in living without ties. His kindness, he said, was a way of honoring his wife's memory. She had always taught him that helping others was the greatest act of love, and through his small acts, he felt connected to her still. Mrs. Taylor couldn't hold back her tears as he shared his story. She felt a profound respect for him, but a deep sadness as well. The idea that this kind man would remain a wanderer, helping others quietly from the shadows, was heartbreaking. But she respected his choice, and they parted that night with an unspoken understanding. Yet, word of Ben's story continued to ripple through the community. Inspired by Mrs. Taylor's dedication, other townspeople began leaving small gifts where they thought he might pass by. A warm jacket, a few dollars, even meals wrapped with care. Although Ben would often leave these gifts untouched, they became a silent testament to the community's growing compassion. People began to look at the homeless in their town with different eyes, wondering about the lives they led, the stories they carried, and the kindnesses they might offer if given the chance. One morning, Mrs. Taylor woke to find an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you, Mrs. Taylor, for seeing me when no one else did. Keep spreading kindness. It matters more than you know." She held the note close, realizing it was his way of saying goodbye. Ben had moved on, but his legacy remained in the hearts of everyone he had touched. The entire town, it seemed, had changed because of one man's quiet acts of generosity. Mrs. Taylor, though saddened, felt a renewed purpose. She continued her mission of kindness, helping others with a warmth and openness that had once been rare in their small community. Ben might have been gone, but his spirit lingered, woven into the fabric of the town, and in every act of kindness, his memory lived on. As weeks passed since Ben's disappearance, Mrs. Taylor found herself thinking of him constantly. His story, though shared quietly between those who knew, had planted a seed in her heart. She could not let him slip away into obscurity, not after all he had done for others, not after his kindness had transformed the way she, and so many others, saw the world. Determined to continue Ben's legacy of quiet generosity, Mrs. Taylor began organizing her neighbors to start a small group dedicated to community support. She called it the Helping Hands, a nod to the way Ben had extended his hand to anyone in need without expecting anything in return. Through word of mouth and casual conversations, her idea began to gain momentum. People who had once walked past strangers without a second thought started paying more attention, noticing when someone looked down, offering a smile, a hand, or a kind word. It was as if Ben's invisible presence had permeated the town. But Mrs. Taylor's thoughts always returned to him, wondering where he might be, what other towns or strangers he was helping. It bothered her that Ben might never know the profound change he had inspired, the movement he had unknowingly set in motion. One evening, during a meeting of the Helping Hands, she mentioned her desire to find Ben, not just to thank him, but to let him see the impact of his actions. Among the attendees was a young man named Sam, a journalist who had recently returned to his hometown after studying in the city. Sam had heard about Ben's story from his mother, who had been one of the first to join the Helping Hands. Deeply moved, he offered to help. "I can try to track him down," Sam suggested, excitement in his voice. "We can publish a story about him. Show him that he matters to this community. Maybe it will reach him, wherever he is." Mrs. Taylor was hesitant at first. She worried that the publicity might go against Ben's humble nature. But after some thought, she realized that it could be a way to honor him, to tell his story not as a means of exposing him, but as a way of celebrating his kindness. The next day, Sam began his investigation, asking around town and looking through public records to see if he could find any trace of where Ben might have gone. He learned that Ben had been seen at various places outside town, a nearby park, a small diner on the highway, and occasionally at a local shelter for the homeless. Sam visited each location, speaking to anyone who might have crossed paths with Ben. Some recognized the description, recalling a man who always seemed willing to share what little he had or offer a kind word. But each lead seemed to grow colder as Sam dug deeper. It was as if Ben was a shadow, moving through the town with barely a trace left behind. Just when Sam was about to lose hope, he met a man named Frank at the shelter who knew more about Ben than anyone else he had spoken to. Frank, an older man with a weary face and a kind smile, recalled sharing a few nights under the same roof with Ben. They had bonded over their shared hardships, and Ben had confided some of his story to him. Frank described Ben as a man haunted by loss, yet filled with an insatiable need to help others, a paradox that intrigued and moved Sam. There was this one night, Frank said, his voice softening. Ben and I sat outside the shelter, talking about life, about the things we both lost. I told him I was thinking about leaving, heading down south, where the winters weren't as harsh. And he told me that wherever I went, I should remember to look for the people who don't get looked at. He called them the invisible ones. He told me it was those people who needed kindness the most. Sam listened intently, feeling a deeper connection to Ben with every word Frank spoke. He scribbled down notes, his heart aching with the weight of Ben's words. Here was a man who had lost everything, yet had managed to hold on to a compassion that went beyond the ordinary. Sam knew that if he found Ben, he would have to approach him carefully, respecting his privacy, but showing him the legacy he had left behind. Meanwhile, back in town, Mrs. Taylor and the helping hands continued their work. Inspired by Ben's philosophy, they began focusing on people in the community who often went unnoticed. They visited elderly residents who rarely left their homes, single parents struggling to make ends meet, and even young people who seemed adrift and alone. Slowly, they saw a shift in the town's atmosphere. People began reaching out to one another more openly, sharing burdens, offering help, and forming connections that had long been absent in their small community. One evening, as Sam was preparing to leave the shelter after another round of questions, Frank caught his arm. "There's one more thing you should know about Ben," he said, his eyes holding a spark of emotion. "Before he left, he gave me a note, told me to give it to someone who might come looking for him one day. I never thought I'd actually meet someone who cared enough to find him, but I think that person is you." With trembling hands, Sam took the note, unfolding the paper carefully. Inside, written in Ben's neat but slightly shaky handwriting, were the words, "If you're reading this, you're looking for something bigger than me. Kindness doesn't need a face. Remember that. And go where kindness takes you." Sam's eyes stung as he read the note. He felt both the weight of Ben's humility and the importance of his message. Here was a man who truly didn't want recognition, who believed that kindness was a force in itself, beyond any single person. Sam returned to Mrs. Taylor with the note, sharing what he had learned, and together they decided that they would honor Ben's request. Instead of a story revealing Ben's identity, Sam wrote an article about the Invisible Kindness Project, sharing tales of people across the town who had been helped by strangers, neighbors, and even passerby, all inspired by Ben's quiet legacy. The story went viral in the local paper, sparking an outpouring of support and empathy from neighboring towns. People from all walks of life wrote letters, sharing how Ben's story had touched them, inspiring them to make small changes in their own lives. Though they never found Ben, his impact was profound. Mrs. Taylor felt a sense of peace, knowing that wherever he was, Ben's spirit was alive in each act of kindness that the helping hands carried out. And as the town continued to transform, people began leaving little notes of kindness around the community, on park benches, bus stops, and even tucked into grocery store shelves, each one signed with just a simple B. Ben's legacy had become more than a story, it was a movement. And Mrs. Taylor, as she walked through town and saw the quiet reminders of his kindness, felt a warmth in her heart, knowing that a single humble act of generosity had changed the lives of so many. Though they might never see him again, Ben had woven himself into the fabric of the community, his legacy as enduring as the memory of his smile. Months passed, and the Invisible Kindness Project had taken root far beyond anything Mrs. Taylor or Sam could have imagined. Their small town had become a beacon of quiet compassion, inspiring similar movements in nearby towns and even across the state. News outlets began covering the initiative, intrigued by the mystery of Ben and the way one homeless man's small acts had sparked an entire community's transformation. Donations flowed in, not only from locals but from people who had read about the project and felt moved to contribute. The Helping Hands group evolved into something larger, with volunteers organizing regular outreach efforts to provide food, clothing, and companionship to those in need. What began as a tribute to Ben's legacy turned into a lifeline for countless individuals, many of whom were struggling silently before the town's kindness revolution. Mrs. Taylor felt proud, yet her heart still carried a sense of longing. She had hoped that somehow, through all this, Ben would hear of the movement he had unknowingly inspired and return to see what he had created. One evening, after another successful community dinner event organized by the Helping Hands, Mrs. Taylor returned home exhausted yet content. She sat down in her armchair, her mind wandering back to the first time she had met Ben in that grocery store aisle. She could still see his gentle smile, hear the quiet humility in his voice. As she reflected, she heard a soft knock at her door. Her heart skipped a beat. It was late, and unexpected visitors were rare at this hour. She rose slowly, her mind racing with curiosity and a touch of anxiety. When she opened the door, she found a familiar figure standing in the dim light of her porch. It was Ben. He looked different, his hair a bit longer, his face lined with more wear than before, yet his eyes held the same warmth and quiet strength she remembered. She felt a lump in her throat as she looked at him, unable to believe her eyes. "Ben," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Hello, Mrs. Taylor," he replied, his smile soft but unmistakably genuine. "I've been hearing some things. It seems you've been busy." Without another word, she pulled him into a hug, her heart pounding with relief and gratitude. They sat together in her small living room, and she poured him a cup of tea, her hands trembling with excitement. She wanted to ask him so much, yet she felt an overwhelming need to simply let him speak, to hear where he had been and why he had returned. Ben took a sip of the tea, savoring it with a look of contentment. "I had to leave for a while," he began, his voice low and steady. "After the stories started spreading, I needed to be somewhere quiet, somewhere where people wouldn't be looking for me. But even as I moved on, I kept hearing whispers about this town and the kindness growing here. I thought it was just a coincidence, but eventually I realized it was you." Mrs. Taylor nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "Ben, you inspired all of us. You showed us what it means to give without expecting anything in return. The Invisible Kindness Project. It's all because of you." He shook his head gently, his face thoughtful. "No, Mrs. Taylor, it's not because of me. It's because you chose to see me, to care enough to understand my story and share it with others. That's what made the difference. I'm just one man, but you turned that small kindness into something much bigger than I ever could." As they spoke, Ben shared snippets of where he had been. Towns along the coast, hidden campsites in forests, small communities where he could be just another face in the crowd. He admitted that he had struggled to understand why people would want to celebrate him, to bring him into the spotlight. His kindness had never been about recognition. It was his way of coping, of honoring the memory of his late wife, who had always believed that the world could be changed through small, thoughtful acts. But as he traveled, he kept encountering people who mentioned the project, who spoke of the mysterious V and the movement he had inspired. It seemed the world had a way of bringing him back to the place where it all began. "It took me a while to come to terms with it," he admitted. "I realized that maybe, just maybe, there was something here I needed to see for myself." Mrs. Taylor listened, feeling the mixture of joy and sorrow for this humble man who had impacted so many lives, yet carried so much hesitation about accepting kindness in return. She told him about the initiatives the Helping Hands had started, the notes of encouragement people left around town, and how neighbors had come together in ways they hadn't in years. Ben listened intently, his eyes growing misty as he heard how deeply he had touched people's lives. Then Ben surprised her. "I'd like to stay," he said quietly. "If you think there's a way for me to be part of this community, I'd like to help." The words were both a relief and a shock to Mrs. Taylor. She had dreamed of Ben returning, but she had always feared he would be too proud, too elusive to stay. She immediately assured him that the town would welcome him with open arms, that they would help him find a place to stay and work he could be proud of. Over the next few days, news of Ben's return spread like wildfire. People from all corners of town came to see him, some out of curiosity, others out of admiration, and still others who had their own quiet stories of his kindness to share. At first, Ben felt overwhelmed by the attention, but he soon realized that this was more than just a fascination with him. It was a celebration of something bigger. He watched as people who had never spoken to one another before came together, exchanging stories and forming connections. He saw families reconnecting, neighbors helping one another, and strangers reaching out to those in need. One morning, Sam approached him with a proposition. "I'd like to interview you, Ben. Not to make you the center of attention, but to share your story in a way that might inspire others beyond our town." He paused, gauging Ben's reaction. "You don't have to share everything, just enough to show people what a little kindness can do." Ben hesitated, but with Mrs. Taylor's gentle encouragement, he agreed. The interview was published in the local paper and quickly circulated, bringing more attention to the Invisible Kindness Project. Donations and offers of support poured in from people across the country, each inspired by Ben's story and the quiet power of compassion. The town eventually set up a small fund in his name, dedicated to helping those in need, whether they were locals or travelers passing through, a tribute to the man who had given so much without expecting anything in return. As the seasons changed, Ben settled into his new life, working at the local library and volunteering with the Helping Hands. Though he still struggled with accepting help, he began to realize that community was as much about receiving as it was about giving. He found himself mentoring young people, sharing wisdom with anyone who sought it, and in doing so, he found a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. Mrs. Taylor watched him with quiet pride, knowing that the man who had once been a stranger was now a cherished part of their town. The small kindnesses he had once offered in anonymity had blossomed into something much greater, a lasting legacy of compassion that bound their community together. And though Ben never sought recognition, the townspeople celebrated him each year, marking the anniversary of his first act of kindness with a day of giving. They called it Ben's Day, a simple but heartfelt tribute to the man who had shown them that one small act could change a life, and that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most powerful messages. As Ben's Day approached, the entire town was buzzing with excitement and anticipation. For weeks, people had been preparing, organizing events, gathering supplies, and planning acts of kindness to honor the man who had unknowingly transformed their community. Mrs. Taylor could hardly believe the scale of the celebration. What had started as a simple tribute had blossomed into a full-day event that would touch every corner of their town. Ben himself, however, felt a bit uneasy about the attention. While he was touched by the community's warmth and admiration, he still struggled to see himself as deserving of such praise. But Mrs. Taylor and Sam gently reminded him that this day wasn't just about him. It was about the kindness he had inspired in others. Ben's Day is a reminder, Mrs. Taylor told him with a reassuring smile, of what you showed us. That small acts of compassion can spark something powerful. This day belongs to everyone you've helped. The morning of Ben's Day dawned clear and crisp, with the first hints of autumn coloring the trees in warm shades of orange and yellow. Families began gathering in the town square early, and there was an air of excitement as children held handmade signs with messages like, "Be kind," and "Pay it forward." Sam had arranged for a local band to play music throughout the day, adding a festive spirit to the event. Booths were set up around the square where people could donate clothes, food, and books. There was even a station where people could write anonymous notes of encouragement to leave in random places around town. a gesture that had become a cherished part of the community, inspired by Ben's own quiet acts of kindness. Throughout the day, Ben moved quietly among the crowd, still somewhat reserved but visibly moved by the outpouring of love and gratitude. People approached him to shake his hand, thank him, and share stories of how his kindness had inspired them. Some were parents who told him how they had taught their children about the importance of helping others because of his example. Others were young people who had felt lost and found comfort in knowing that there were people like Ben in the world. But there were also some individuals who had never met Ben before, people who had traveled from neighboring towns to be part of the celebration. The story of Ben and the Invisible Kindness Project had spread far beyond the borders of their small town, drawing people from all walks of life who wanted to experience and participate in this unique day of kindness. As Ben looked around, he realized just how far-reaching the impact of his actions had become. Midday, Sam stepped up to a small stage in the center of the square, a microphone in hand. He introduced himself, thanking everyone for attending, and then began to tell the story of how Ben's first act of kindness had set everything in motion. He shared stories of how one man's compassion had sparked a movement, reminding people of their shared humanity and the difference they could make in each other's lives. Ben showed us that kindness doesn't need an audience, that it doesn't need applause, Sam said, his voice filled with emotion. But today we applaud him, not just for what he's done, but for reminding us of who we can be. When Sam finished, the crowd erupted into applause, and Ben felt his face flush with a mixture of humility and gratitude. As the applause faded, Mrs. Taylor walked up to him, holding a small, intricately wrapped box. She handed it to him, her eyes shining with pride. "This is from all of us, Ben. Just a little something to show our appreciation." With some hesitation, Ben unwrapped the gift to find a beautifully crafted journal, each page inscribed with a note or message from someone in the community. Every page held a story, a memory, or a simple message of thanks from people who had been touched by his kindness. Some pages contained drawings from children, others held quotes or personal reflections. Ben felt his throat tighten as he leafed through the pages, each one a testament to the countless lives he had impacted without even realizing it. But the surprises weren't over yet. As Ben thanked everyone, Sam stepped forward once more with another announcement. Today, in honor of Ben's legacy, we're thrilled to announce the creation of the Ben Andrews Community Center, he declared, gesturing to a large banner that had been hidden until that moment. The crowd gasped, and Ben looked on in stunned silence. The community center, Sam explained, would serve as a place for anyone in need, a sanctuary for the homeless, a resource for families struggling to make ends meet, and a safe space for young people to find mentorship and support. It would be a place where the town's legacy of kindness could live on, offering hope and help to anyone who needed it. Donations had poured in from locals and even strangers who had heard Ben's story, allowing the center to become a reality. Ben was overwhelmed. The idea that a building, a space dedicated to fostering compassion, would bear his name was almost too much to process. Mrs. Taylor, sensing his awe, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Ben, this center is more than a building. It's a symbol of what you've given us, a place for people to feel seen, cared for, and supported, just as you have done for all of us." The rest of the day was filled with acts of kindness. Children delivered handmade thank you cards to the elderly residents at a nearby nursing home. Volunteers from the Helping Hands went door to door, offering assistance to families who could use a little extra help. In the park, a group of teenagers handed out flowers and coffee to strangers, explaining that they were doing it in the spirit of Ben's day. Each act, no matter how small, carried a piece of Ben's legacy with it. As evening fell, the townspeople gathered once more, this time for a candlelight vigil. The square was filled with the warm glow of hundreds of candles, each one held high as people shared a moment of quiet reflection. Mrs. Taylor spoke softly, leading a brief tribute to Ben and the ideals he had inspired. She reminded everyone that kindness wasn't just a one-day event, but a lifelong commitment, a choice to see and help others as Ben had. Ben, standing among them, felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging. He looked at the faces around him, people he had once thought of as strangers, now friends, family in a way he had never expected. As he gazed at the crowd, he realized that this town, these people, had become his home. The vigil ended with a song, a simple, heartfelt melody that floated through the crisp night air, carrying a message of hope and unity. When the song finished, people lingered, unwilling to let go of the sense of togetherness they felt. One by one, they approached Ben, each offering a few words, a smile, or a hug. By the time the last candle was extinguished, Ben was left with a profound sense of peace, knowing that he was no longer alone. Later that night, as he walked through the empty streets with Mrs. Taylor at his side, Ben finally voiced the thought that had been in his heart all day. "I never expected any of this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I just wanted to help a little." Mrs. Taylor smiled, her eyes filled with gentle understanding. "Sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference, Ben. You've shown us that. And now it's our turn to carry it forward." Ben nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. For the first time in years, he felt truly at home, not just in the town but in his own heart. The kindness he had shared so freely had come full circle, embracing him and giving him a place to belong. As he walked back to his modest apartment, gifted to him by a family he had once helped, he looked up at the stars, feeling the presence of his late wife, as if she, too, were part of this legacy of love. Ben Andrews had come home, and his legacy of kindness would live on, not just in the community center, not just in the annual celebration, but in every act of compassion, every hand extended in friendship, every moment when one person chose to see another. He had changed a town, yes, but more than that. He had reminded everyone that in a world often filled with hardships, kindness could be the light that led them forward. As the months turned into years, Ben's presence in the town became an integral part of its fabric, and his story continued to inspire generations. The Ben Andrews Community Center blossomed into a sanctuary for all who walked through its doors. The Helping Hands group, which had once been just a handful of passionate volunteers, had now grown into a full-fledged organization with dozens of dedicated members who worked tirelessly to honor Ben's legacy. The center's reach extended far beyond the town, as people from neighboring communities sought to replicate the success of the Invisible Kindness Project. Families, single parents, the elderly, and young people alike found support there. The center offered free meals, counseling services, job training, tutoring for children, and countless other resources that helped people rebuild their lives. Volunteers organized weekly outreach events, heading into parts of town that had long been neglected, bringing supplies, lending a listening ear, and spreading the message of kindness. Ben became a mentor to many of the young volunteers, who looked up to him not only for his wisdom but for his quiet humility and gentle strength. He spent his days at the center, helping wherever he could, whether it was organizing donations, sitting with someone in crisis, or simply sharing a cup of coffee with those who wanted a moment of peace. He often told stories to the young people who came to the center, sharing little bits of his life and the lessons he learned. In his own way, Ben had become a teacher once again, imparting values of compassion, resilience, and the importance of seeing others beyond their circumstances. The annual Ben's Day celebration grew larger each year, drawing people from far and wide. It became a day of not only giving but also remembering. People shared stories of kindness they had experienced or witnessed, reminding everyone of the impact that small acts of compassion could have. The town square would be filled with booths offering free meals, clothes, and small tokens for anyone who needed them. Volunteers took to the streets, delivering care packages to those who couldn't attend, from elderly residents to families who had fallen on hard times. In one of these Ben's Day celebrations, a young woman named Maya arrived with her 2 children, clutching a worn-out coat around her shoulders. She was new to the town, having left a difficult situation behind in search of a fresh start. When she heard about the celebration, she initially hesitated, unsure if she'd be welcome. But as she wandered through the town square, watching strangers exchange smiles and gifts, she felt an overwhelming sense of belonging. The Helping Hands volunteers greeted her warmly, offering her a meal and winter coats for her children. As Maya settled down with her children, she noticed Ben sitting nearby, speaking to a group of teenagers about resilience and the power of kindness. His words struck a chord with her. He spoke not just as someone who had experienced hardship, but as someone who had emerged with a heart full of compassion. After the gathering, she found the courage to approach him. She introduced herself, sharing bits of her story, and Ben listened with the same attentiveness he showed everyone who crossed his path. By the end of their conversation, he offered her a place at the community center where she could find support, stability, and perhaps even a chance to rebuild her life. Maya soon became a regular at the center, volunteering to help others in situations similar to her own. She took every opportunity to express her gratitude to Ben, who had opened a door to a life she thought she'd lost forever. Her children became part of the extended family the center had created, finding friends, mentors, and a sense of safety they hadn't known before. Maya's life transformed as she found work and slowly built a new life, all while giving back to the community that had welcomed her. As the years continued to pass, Ben witnessed countless stories like Maya's, stories of people who came to the center looking for help and left with a renewed sense of hope and dignity. He became a quiet legend, a figure who symbolized not only kindness, but also the power of a life lived with purpose. He often reflected on how his journey, filled with loss and hardship, had brought him to this place where he could make a difference in ways he had never imagined. Though his humility never allowed him to take full credit for the community's transformation, everyone knew that Ben was the heart of the center. People from all walks of life came to him for advice, solace, and encouragement. Young people, especially, were drawn to him, seeing in him a role model who had overcome adversity with grace and who believed in them when they struggled to believe in themselves. One winter, as Ben was helping set up decorations for the annual holiday celebration at the center, he caught a glimpse of Mrs. Taylor across the room, her silver hair gleaming as she laughed with some of the children who had come to help. She noticed him watching and came over, her eyes filled with warmth. "Ben," she said softly, "look at what you've created here." He shook his head, smiling. "It was never just me, Mrs. Taylor. This was all of us." She chuckled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're too humble, Ben. Without you, none of this would have happened. You've given people hope, a second chance, and a reminder of the goodness in the world. That's more than most people do in a lifetime." They stood together, watching as families mingled, children played, and volunteers exchanged hugs and laughter. The center buzzed with a sense of belonging and joy that had become its hallmark. Ben felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a peace that had eluded him for so long. For the first time, he truly felt that his life, filled with both sorrow and redemption, had come full circle. Years later, when Ben was no longer around, his legacy lived on, as strong and vibrant as ever. The Ben Andrews Community Center continued to thrive, with people from new generations carrying on the torch of kindness he had lit. Young adults who had once been mentored by Ben became mentors themselves, sharing his lessons with the same passion he had once shown them. The annual Ben's Day celebration grew into a statewide event, drawing people from all backgrounds, each inspired to give back in their own way. On one such Ben's Day, a mural was unveiled on the side of the community center, a tribute to Ben, painted by local artists who had grown up hearing stories of his kindness. The mural depicted Ben sitting on a bench, his kind eyes gazing out at the town, surrounded by scenes of people helping one another, a testament to the impact he had made on countless lives. Below the mural was a simple inscription: "In a world where you can be anything, be kind." Visitors from near and far came to see the mural, taking pictures, leaving flowers, and reflecting on the man who had become a legend. For the people of the town, the mural was more than a work of art. It was a reminder of the man who had walked among them, quietly teaching them to be better, to reach out to those in need, and to build a community rooted in compassion. Long after Ben's passing, his spirit remained a guiding light. His story was told to children in classrooms, shared at family gatherings, and remembered during moments of struggle and hardship. He had shown them that one person, no matter how humble, could make a profound difference. His legacy became a permanent part of the town's identity, woven into its values and its people. And so, every year on Ben's Day, people gathered at the community center to honor his memory, each one carrying forward the lesson he had taught them. That kindness, though often quiet and unseen, was the most powerful gift they could offer one another. In a world filled with challenges, Ben's legacy of compassion continued to shine, reminding them all that in every act of kindness, his spirit lived on.